the portion speaks about the laws of vows and oaths, and to what degree one is bound to his word, and if he violates his word when it's within the context of an oath or a shvua, an oath or a vow, there's serious liability. And the Torah speaks about a husband being able to nullify a vow or an oath, and a father, if the daughter is still in his domain and she's an adult, meaning from the age of 12 to 12 and a half, where she's an adult, but she's still in the jurisdiction of a father, if she makes a vow, the father is able to nullify the vow, even unbeknown to her that he nullified the vow. However, when he nullifies it, it's from the moment he hears it, it has to be nullified. On that day, he becomes aware of it. But there's a difference in the terminology between the nullification of a vow by a father or a husband, and when you go before what we call a bezdin, a rabbinic court, the terminology is a different terminology. A father or a husband, when he nullifies a vow or an oath, he says mufar. He says it should be nullified. Why? Because she's in his jurisdiction, and if he's not agreeable, the vow should be a vow, and he states his disapproval, it's immediately nullified. But if the woman herself, let's say, would go to a bezdin, and she would want to nullify the vow, you have to find, so there it's speaking about she had a right to make the vow. Let's say she's not in her father's jurisdiction. She's beyond the age of 12 and a half. Or she's not married. She's not in the jurisdiction of her husband. And she wants to nullify the vow. So since the vow was a valid vow, the only way it could be nullified, you have to find that there was some weakness in the vow, and the Chacham, the Bezdin, finds the weakness, and based on that weakness, the vow is considered like a mistaken vow. The vow was made by mistake. But the two terminologies, for the father's disapproval of the vow, or the husband, it's called hafara. Hafara means that disapproves. The moment they disapprove, the vow doesn't exist, the oath doesn't exist. When the woman goes herself before the bezdin, it's called hatorah. It's the undoing of the vow. The bezdin undoes the vow, meaning they find some degree of weakness in the vow or the oath, and that is the basis why the vow and the oath doesn't exist any longer. But it's a whole different process. In Hebrew, mutter means untied. It's permitted. They find a weakness in the vow. For instance, a person makes a vow, he says, and he believed that there was a certain person who he felt had done something wrong to him, and that's why he made the vow. And he said, my property is off limits to that person. Then he realizes later that he misevaluated that person. And if he would have known, he wouldn't have made the vow. He goes before the bezdin and he presents the reason why he wants the vow to be nullified. The vow is nullified. Person accepts something upon himself, then realizes it was too difficult for him to carry out, because he felt the relationship, he could do without that relationship. He realized he can't do without the relationship. So he regrets that he ever made the vow or made the oath. That's called charoto. The vow, that is a basis for the court, for the bezdin, to nullify the vow or to nullify the shvur. Now, nedorim, a neder is a vow. A neder, a shvur is an oath. The Baal HaTurim says over here that the gematria, the numerical value of nedorim, is rotzeach. Rotzeach means a murder. Now the question is why? So he cites the Gemara in Shavuos. The Gemara says in Shavuos that a person who's loose and not careful about vows, ishto ubanav mesid. The consequence of that is, God forbid, his wife dies, and his children who are minors, they could actually die because of that, which we'll discuss in a moment. But that is one of the very severe consequences of a person being bound by a vow and he doesn't keep the vow. So Nedorim have that edge to it, that he's the equivalent of a murderer. Due to his lack of carefulness with vows, he brings about this very serious liability for his family, that his wife forfeits her life and his children lose their lives. Therefore, the numerical value of Nedorim is vow, is Rotzeach. Rotzeach is a murderer. Now, why is this such a serious consequence? So let's say why the wife. I mean, the wife does nothing, but because the husband is not careful regarding vows, one of the liabilities is that his wife, God forbid, loses her life. What's it all about? If you remember, we had discussed that the Torah juxtaposes the law of the sota, the suspected adulteress, to the law of the distribution of the tithes to the Kohen. And Rashi over there cites the Medrash. What is the value of the juxtaposition? That a man who doesn't bring the bikurim to the Kohen, the new fruits to the Kohen, he withholds it. Ultimately, he's going to bring his wife to the Kohen as a suspected adulteress. Could you hold one moment, please? So we explained that because the husband is a withholding person, I mean, why should his wife become a suspected adulteress? In what way does the wife have any level of culpability because the husband was a miserly person, not willing to give the bikurim? So we explained it this way, and we explained it many things with this concept, that there's a concept known as shmira. Person merits shmira, meaning divine protection. A man who gives the bikurim, the proper tithes to the Kohen, as he should, because of that, his wife is protected. What does it mean his wife is protected? Because the question was, because the husband fails the wife, why should she be held accountable and becomes a suspected adulteress? The answer is no. In the merit of the husband, the wife will merit a level of divine protection that another man's not going to have his eye on his wife, or his wife will not have an interest in any other man. That's the divine protection. But if in fact the husband withholds the bikurim, the new fruits or the new grain from the Kohen, his wife doesn't merit that protection due to the husband. Now she's exposed to a situation where she has to fend for herself. So the reason why she's becoming the suspected adulteress is because she succumbed to a certain level of temptation. But why wasn't she protected from that temptation? Because the husband wasn't worthy, because he had failed, that her husband wouldn't provide that divine protection. That's how we explained it. So really, the wife, if she chooses to misbehave, it's her own misbehavior. So that's her personal culpability. But if the husband would have done what he was supposed to do by giving the tithe to the Kohen, in his marriage, he would have merited divine protection. That's the concept. Okay? A person has, we have mentioned many times, what is Midas Hadin, what's Midas Harachmim? So Ramchal explains, there's no such thing as a person has a perfect record. Nobody has a perfect record. Shlomo tells us in Koheles, there's no perfect tzaddik. So if every person's record is flawed, so why isn't he prosecuted for that failing which is on his record? The answer is, the only time Hashem allows prosecution is only at certain moments. Satan always wants to prosecute. Satan is the prosecutor of Jewish people. But whenever he wants to prosecute, Hashem says, I don't want to hear from you. So as long as Hashem doesn't allow Satan to audit a person's record, Midas HaRachman's in place. And with all of us, Baruch Hashem, Hashem doesn't allow Satan to audit the record, and as a result of that, there's no basis for prosecution. Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment, that day, Hashem allows every human being's record to be audited. And therefore, it's a serious moment. But however, we have the schus, the merit of the shofar, which is the merit of the Akedah. When we blow the shofar, that activates a merit which silences the prosecution. So Sodom can no longer prosecute. That's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. That's the idea. A wife, nobody's perfect. If a husband abides by his vows, the wife, Hashem does not allow his wife's record to be audited. But if the husband fails and he's careless regarding his nedorim, his merit's not going to protect his wife. If his merit doesn't protect his wife, now his wife is exposed to what? To the prosecution of what? Of Satan, as anybody is. But even more so, because since normally the merit of the husband protects the wife, and here that protection is removed because the husband is not worthy of that level of protection, therefore his wife now succumbs to her own flawed record, but it's her record that's being prosecuted. That's the understanding. So it's not the failing of the husband, because the husband failed, therefore the wife dies. Because the husband failed, the wife doesn't merit the protection of the husband, his schus, that his schus should sign with the prosecution of the wife's record. I mentioned that the term that a husband or a father nullifies the netter of a wife is called hafara. That means he nullifies, it's a disapproval. I disapprove. When he becomes aware he disapproves, the netter automatically is nullified. Has nothing to do whether she wants it, doesn't want it, because since the wife is in the jurisdiction of the father, the woman, up to the age of 12 and a half, the husband has a right, the father has a right to approve or disapprove of that vow. He disapproves of the vow is nullified. Whether she wants it to be or not does make a difference. A wife being in the jurisdiction of her husband, when she's married to him, certain types of vows, the husband, if he disapproves, it's a vow which affects their relationship. It's that kind of vow. She has no right to make that vow. So if he chooses to nullify it, he nullifies it because he disapproves. That's only because she's in his jurisdiction regarding certain levels of relationship. But if a woman is not married, or a man makes a vow, a man is not in his own jurisdiction. If you want to nullify that vow, you have to go before a bezdin. You have to go before a rabbinic court, and they have to find someone of weakness in that vow. And if there is that weakness, then the vow is nullified because retroactively the vow never existed. The Gemara says like this: if a woman makes a vow and the husband's not aware of it, and he only becomes aware of it 2 weeks later, and he's aware, and the day he becomes aware of it, he nullifies it. His nullification immediately nullifies it, but it's not nullified retroactively. It's nullified from the moment that he nullifies it. So let's say she made a vow that she's not going to drink wine, and the husband becomes aware of it 2 weeks later, and he nullifies it. And she had drunk wine up to that point, and she was forewarned that she should not drink wine. She's going to get lashes for violating a vow. Anytime, because the vow was in effect. The vow was in effect because the husband did not yet disapprove of it yet.
I understand. I'm trying to say, in the same way that his merit may protect or not her, does her merit protect or not protect him?
No. Her merit does not protect him.
So it's not a two-way.
Correct. It's because she's under his umbrella. Being under his umbrella, therefore, it overarches and protects her. That's the concept. But if that umbrella is what he is withdrawn, then she's not protected any longer. Now she's subject to an audit. Once she's subject to an audit, then she has a problem. Because there's always a very serious consequence to an audit, which is Midas Hadin. That's the attribute of justice.
So she may be a beneficiary if she's loose with her own vows of the protection of her husband, but the reverse is not the case.
Correct. So now I just want to explain why a vow is so serious. In other areas, the woman still has the attribute of mercy, but it's only when the husband violates his vows or he's careless, it has this level of negative consequence. So we had once had said, now, I said this recently, this I never said before. The Gemara tells us in Brachos that a person is not permitted to benefit from this world through eating or drinking unless it's predicated on a bracha. It's called the ocha v'shosa b'bracha is mo'al. If you eat or drink without acknowledging Hashem within the context of bracha, it's the equivalent of benefiting something that's consecrated. If you acknowledge that Hashem is the creator, is the almighty, so on and so forth, you say the bracha, then it's released. Hashem releases it into your domain. It's based on a pasuk in Tehillim. Hashemayim Shemayim Hashem v'artzo sam l'bnei Adam. Then once you acknowledge that Hashem is the master, he's the almighty, then Hashem releases into your domain. But until then, it's in Hashem's domain. Being in God's domain is like something that's consecrated. You're violating of what? Of eating or drink something that's consecrated. So the Gemara asks a question, what about if you smell fragrance? Does one have to say a bracha on fragrance? So the Gemara answers, yes. Why? It's based on a pasuk in Tehillim, because David HaMelech says, Kol ad neshama talel ko, halal ko. That every soul is mahalil ko, praises ko. So the Gemara says, when somebody smells something, you smell something, a fragrance, what part of the human being benefits from that? That's the neshama. The neshama benefits from fragrance. Meaning when we eat or drink, what benefits from that? That's the physicality of the person. The only thing that a person, the sense of smell, that sense is a spiritual sense. One's soul is touched by that. And that's the reason why, Motzoi Shabbos, that we lose this expanded level of soul. Part of the Abdullah service is besomim, right? We smell the besomim. Because the besomim is the equivalent like smelling salts. It's to revive ourselves. Because we're diminished, our souls are diminished. So therefore, the soul is compensated with the fragrance that it inhales. So the neshama is a direct beneficiary of what? Of fragrance. Food and drink has nothing to do with the soul. Food and drink is what? Is the body. Fragrance is the soul. So that's the only aspect of our physical existence, when we're physical beings, that we're touched, our souls are touched by some level of benefit. Now, the power of speech. That a human being has the ability to speak. Is that a physical characteristic, or is that a spiritual characteristic? So the Chofetz Chaim always cites the Targum Onkelos. It's when we speak about the creation of Adam, the Torah says he creates the physicality of Adam. Then it says, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. He blew into his nostrils a soul of life. Vayhi lenefesh chayo. And he became a living entity. Vayhi lenefesh chayo. So the Targum Onkelos says, when he blew the soul of life in through his nostrils, he became a living species. He says he became ruach memalo. He became a speaking species. When he blew the soul of life, from that emanates the ability to speak. So speech is a direct outgrowth of the soul. Anything else is the physicality of the person. But speech is due to the spirituality of the soul. That's why a person has the ability to speak. There's an expression in English, one's word is sacred. We don't say your action is sacred. One's word is sacred. Why is one's word sacred? Because factually speaking, the power of speech is what? Is direct derivative, an expression of the neshama. So since the soul is the only part of the person which has that degree of holiness, it's not part of physical existence, and speech is a derivative of the neshama. As a result of that, that's why speech is sacred. So when one abuses one's speech, you violate one's speech. What area are you violating? You're violating something which is at a level of value which is beyond the level of anything in your physical life. As a result of that, that's what has this level of consequence. The pasuk, you should not profane your words. Yachel. Yachel means you should not profane your word. All that comes out of your mouth, you must abide by that. When we speak of profaning something that's holy, we speak profane. Something that's not holy, you don't profane it. Okay? I mean, years ago, today you don't hear this expression any longer. Something which is inappropriate speech was called a profanity, right? Why was it called a profanity? Because speech has a certain degree of representation. You don't use speech to say that kind of word. You're profaning your speech. That's what's called profanity. But it's based on this pasuk. When you make the vow or oath, you're bound by it, because a vow and oath is only a vow, you have to articulate it. What about a person who thinks a vow? You think, in your mind, you swear, but you don't verbalize it. You don't say those words. It's not an oath. It's not a vow. You must articulate it. If it's articulated, that means your power of speech established a certain status. Now you're bound by that. And if you should violate it, you're profaning your speech. Because, as I said, speech is sacred. So by doing something and not abiding by it, that's called profaning your speech. And because it comes from a spiritual source, as a result of that, it has this level of negative consequence, which God forbid, which is very serious.
Rabbi, don't we say that
The Gemara in Eruvin tells over a story that Bruria, who was this wife of Reb Meir, who was the daughter of Rab Hananya ben Trajan, who's one of the 10 martyrs, she goes through the Beis Medrash, and she was a very learned woman. And there was one of her husband's students were learning, and he was learning, but he wasn't verbalizing the Torah that he was studying. So she goes over to him and she reprimands him. She says, don't you realize you're wasting your time? Because the pasuk says the Torah brings ultimately life to the person. Chaim hi lemotzeim. It brings life to the one who's motzi bepeh. When you articulate the Torah, it's articulation that ultimately, that's what mostly impacts on the person. You have to verbalize the Torah. And since you're not verbalizing it, you're just eye-reading it. Without verbalizing it, it does not have the effect that it's supposed to have. Because it's chaim hi lemotzeim. It brings life to the one who's motzi bepeh. That's the Gemara in Eruvin. Now, if we say Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'soretz, God created the world for what reason? For Torah, and the only people who are qualified are Klal Yisrael. We speak about Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The Gemara tells us a kedushin Godla Talmud shatov maybe libaseh. Torah study is great because only through Torah study does that bring to the actualization of the mitzvah. The prerequisite to mitzvah is the study of Torah. So what does everything hinge on? Everything hinges on the study of Torah. As a result of that, if the objective of creation is the fulfillment of the Torah, and everything hinges on the study of Torah, so if that's the case, and we say Chaim in Motzoeim, and when does Torah take on that level of effect? It's only when you articulate it. If that's the case, man has to be endowed with power of speech, which is a derivative of the neshama. Therefore, it impacts on the soul, because directly it was endowed because of the soul. The soul has that ability, because through that ability, which is speech, through that, the Torah takes on more of a realistic reality to bring about the actualization of Torah itself. That's the concept. The Chofetz Chaim, in his introduction to the law, to his work Shmiras Haloshen, or Chofetz Chaim, over there he explains that since Torah itself and Tefillah, it takes on that special value through its verbalization. So if you go and you profane your mouth, you putrefy your mouth. As a result of that, every word that comes out of your mouth which would have that special level of value, spiritually speaking, now is semi-putrefied because it's being articulated by a mouth that it's spoken Lashon Hara. You've already profaned your mouth. Therefore, what comes out of that mouth doesn't have that level of viability, and it's minimized almost to an if it's 100 to 1, it's minimized to 5. That's what its value is. As a result of that, the effect of Torah to be effective on yourself or on the world, it's minimized to that degree. And as a result of that, that's why it is such a serious claim against the person. Your tefillah is not a tefillah, and your Torah is not a Torah, compared to what it could be. Because since you putrefied your mouth, every word that comes out is associated with that level of putrefaction. That's the Chofetz Chaim. Okay, now let's get back to Ernie's question. Could you hold just one moment? Saying that speech is a derivative of the soul, but yet we say that if you say something and you violate a negative commandment through speech, it's called lav shein bo maaseh. Since it's not done through an action, there's less liability, right? One's not subject to malchus as a result of that. So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Yesodei Torah that although when you do things through words, it doesn't necessarily carry, you don't have punishment. The Bezdin does not punish the person. It doesn't mean that the liability and the seriousness is not more serious than an action. That's the Rambam writes. It can be more serious. I'll give you an example. There's a famous Marsha in Sanhedrin. We had read about there's a type of idolatry called molech. What's molech? If a person passes a child between, they would have fires on either side, and they would have priests of this type of idolatry, and the parent gives his child over to the priest, and they pass the child between these torches, and that was the ritual of this molech. So the Torah says, "Lo yitein mizaro lemolech." You should not give of your children to molech. What does that mean? So the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, let's say a person only has one child, and he gives that one child to undergo this procedure called molech, this ritual of molech. One, he's not subject to the death penalty, although it's idolatry. Why? Because it says, mi zaro v'lo kol zaro. It says, of your progeny you should not give, but not all your progeny. If he has one child, that's all that he has. So the question is, but it's kal v'chomer. If you give of your progeny, you're subject to the death penalty. But if you give all your progeny, because you only have one son, you're not subject to death penalty. What's the rationale? Right? So the Mashal cites a Bahag, Balachos Gedolos, which is a Rishon, and he explains it this way. The Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin that the death penalty is an atonement process. When one, as we see, the Mishnah says, when one, before a person's put to death, he has to say vidui. He has to confess, he has to do tshuva, and then afterwards he's put to death. What about if something is so severe, so serious, so it's vidui together with the death penalty brings about the atonement? What about something is so severe, it's beyond the court even in instituting death penalty, it's not sufficient to atone. If that's the case, it's in God's domain. So therefore, mizar, if you gave of your children to molech, not all your children, that's atonable. But if a person gave his only child, it's so severe that even the death penalty would not atone for that sin. That's the bahag. That's the Baal Halochos Gedolos. And that's the concept of Onshin Min Adin. You can't apply the concept of Kal V'chomer when it comes to punishment because we have no understanding of what the degree of liability is. So therefore, punishment should be sufficient to atone for that particular act. That's the bahag. Therefore, it's mizaro and not kol zaro. So I'm saying, so that's what Rambam says. Just because one is not subject to malchus, because it's lav shein bo maaseh, and because he didn't use words, it doesn't mean to say it's not more serious. It is more serious. However, it's so serious that it's beyond the reach of the Bezdin, whatever they could do, it will not atone for what you did. Therefore, you're not subject to Malchus or whatever else you may be subject to.